Well, of course, this is one of the all-time greatest books of the 20th century, certainly George Orwell's Animal Farm. And this is the graphic novel adaptation of it. We'll get into it. How many people actually, I think I sent it to 2 people. So if you didn't read it, don't worry, we'll have a good conversation about it. There was a movie. Yeah, there was a movie. I think it was in the 50s, wasn't it? It was an animated cartoon movie version. I remember we watched it in high school. Anybody have any quick comments, or should we just jump into it? Let's see. Desktop. Yeah, that's right. Okay. Let's just jump into it then. George Orwell's Animal Farm, the graphic novel. I'm hoping you're at least familiar with George Orwell's Animal Farm. Everybody should be. I would say that I quite liked this adaptation. I actually enjoyed it. The artwork is splendid, really. I've never heard of this guy. O'Dare, I think his name is. Yeah,
I assume these are watercolors, are they?
Yeah, so it looks to me, yeah, very painterly. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure if it's watercolors. Maybe it's some kind of acrylics. I don't know, but very, very nice work, I thought. Yeah, I mean, he just goes into that expressionistic early 20th century or late 19th century style of painting.
Well, not an expert, yeah, but this tends to look a bit like watercolor somehow. Maybe I'm mistaken. Are any experts here?
Well, there are a couple artists present, and if they can speak up, but I don't think that is watercolor. I don't think it is. It looks like, yeah, some kind of acrylics. But again, yeah, you're right. I'm not an expert either. But no, I don't think. Yeah, watercolor, you get the watery effect a little bit.
Is this the 1954 one? An hour, 12 minutes?
Or is it the animated movie?
No, the one for this meeting.
Okay, I don't know what you're talking about. You said an hour and 24. That would be the animated movie. What else are you talking about?
Which year Animal Farm are you talking about?
There's more than one?
Looking at the graphic novel.
I didn't know.
Oh, it's a graphic novel? I thought it was movie night or something.
Yes,
actually, Animal Farm is a book. First started as a book by George Orwell.
Oh, yeah. Right. Okay, so it's a book discussion, not a movie thing.
No.
Okay.
It's a book on which there was an animated movie, if I'm not wrong, as David was mentioning, and he was just presenting a presentation, by some artists who have have portrayed the book in some graphic form.
Yeah, every Friday night we come together and talk about a good graphic novel that we've talked about, and we've been here since June. And we've done a lot of graphic novels, and this is Animal Farm by O'Dare. And I actually enjoyed this. Of course, it helps to be familiar with the book or seen the movie. But it's one of the classics of the 20th century, George Orwell's allegory of a lot of events. I'm sure people will want to talk about it. Historical events. But yeah, I think he took a very respectful approach to the book. It's all there. The story is there. He was very considerate about the main points and the themes. This was a very thoughtful presentation of the story. I certainly appreciated the effort and the respect he had for it. And I think it's a very straightforward adaptation of the story. And very nice artwork. I mean, art is always going to be subjective. You may not care for it, but I liked it. I quite liked it. It's unusual for comics. You don't usually get this kind of painterly, expressionistic visuals in the comics medium, but I really liked it. I enjoyed it. Yeah, and he doesn't always stick to the same thing, as you can see. You know, depending on the sequence, he'll change up he'll vary his approach when necessary. That's nice. Keeps your interest up and helps match the visual with the narrative and the text. Always important in the comics form. It's never one versus the other. That should be a blend of the two, of course. Yeah, I like this. I think if you were going to present this to high school children, we didn't read it. We watched the movie when I was in high school in civic studies, I believe was the class. And we watched the movie, and most people should be aware of this book. It's an important book. And if you are going to present it to middle schoolers, grade schoolers, I think this would be a good way to do so. I think it would be. You'd be able to get a hold of the, let's face it, we're no longer a reading culture. So we're visual mainly. So if you are going to present this to middle schoolers, I think this would be a good way to do so. And it's quite, I liked it. It's very artistic. It's very creative. He puts some creative energy, creative juice into it. I thought.
Well, this is a curious thing. This is the first sort of new creation of the story or recreation of the story in how long?
Yeah, you might have a point. I don't know. I would think people had been adapting Animal Farm in different media, but you might be right.
Well, yeah. I assume the dialogue is very much close to the original book.
That's true.
Or possibly taken directly out of the original book.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
So I get the impression that this guy wants to preserve something, wants to reissue something. He feels there's a valuable story here which could get lost. So he's throwing it out in a form which can be easily grabbed by anybody. Right. You don't have to be anybody smart to get through this.
Right.
Just had a quick question. So is this a single artist or are there multiple people drawing this?
Yeah, the guy's name is O'Dare. I don't really know anything about him. Here he is right here, illustrated by O'Dare. Of course, George Orwell. Yeah.
It's what, like about 200 pages?
Yeah, it's about 170, okay. 180 pages altogether.
That's quite a bit of work.
I would imagine so. It probably took him a number of years to get this. This was published from Penguin Classics. If you haven't purchased a copy, I would urge you to, because this is, Eric Blair still under the copyright. That's, of course, George Orwell, if you didn't know. The estate of Sonia Orwell. Adair Bernardi. Yeah, I think he's Spanish. Or no, maybe South American, maybe. I'm not actually sure. I don't know much about him, but remarkable that he did this.
What does it say in the introduction? Is there an introduction?
There's no introduction. No, it's just Penguin Random House, UK edition we got here. When did this, or a year on this? No, but I think it just came out a couple of years ago, or maybe sooner. It doesn't actually say. Oh yeah, 2018. 2018. Yeah. There you go. Brazil. He's Brazilian. There we go. He's Brazilian.
The reason why I ask to look at the introduction is because the original introduction to the book was actually not published when it was published. It was actually censored.
I see. Okay. Yeah. I think I remember hearing that. That's true. Yeah. That's true. Here we go. All text included in this volume is true to George Orwell's original work. Well, there you go. Yeah. It did seem to me that, yes, I've read the book and I've seen the movie and the animated film. And yeah, these are all Orwell's original sentences. And it's a very, very responsible. When you're doing an adaptation of something, you don't necessarily have to be one-to-one faithful, because different media are different art forms and they do different things. So the point is to adapt it. But I would think you still have to be mindful of preserving the intent and the themes of the original work. even when you're adapting it, even when you're changing things. It doesn't look to me like he changed a lot. He didn't take very many liberties at all. He just did a straight adaptation of Orwell's story. And I certainly appreciate that. And he did keep in mind the differences of course, the comics form compared to prose. And I think he was very successful in what he accomplished here. I really do. I think this was a successful adaptation. Okay, so enough of that. So does anybody want to talk about the the story itself? Because this is one of the all-time greatest books written of the 20th century. Everybody agrees on that.
Well, of course, the whole point was it was a fable of Orwell's ideas, his central themes put into childhood principles.
Right.
Well,
expressed
I mean,
in the childhood manner.
well, it's a critique of
It's a
the,
nursery rhyme.
it's a critique of what's a discussion in treatment of the Soviet Union and Soviet history, and particularly the killing of Snowball, which is Trotsky. And so it's a simple story, really, of again the corruption of the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly a tragedy. I mean, it's a I mean, some of the history was a tragedy as well. It's a terrible, just sad, very sad story, isn't it?
Well, Orwell himself was a socialist, but he had something of a falling out because of his experience in the Spanish Civil War. And what happens in the context of the Spanish Civil War is that the Stalinists are not really interested in winning the Spanish Civil War. They're actually more interested in hunting down Trotskyites. And so Orwell then becomes a critic of Stalin and Stalinism. And so he writes, 1984, and he writes this book as well as specific criticisms, again, of what the Soviet Union had become under Stalin. Right. And so, I mean, there's, he actually, Orwell, 1984 and this book sort of are books that are, to a very high degree, especially 84, are celebrated on the right. But I think they also misunderstand Orwell's politics, right? They think he's a critic and enemy of communism and socialism. But again, it's really much more and specifically a criticism of Stalin. And again, the corruption of the Soviet Union, that takes place under Stalin. And so in the end, we see that, the pig, the lead pig, I know Snowball, I forget the other one's name, which represents Stalin, right? He signs a pact with the humans, right? And that represents the Stalin-Hitler non-aggression pact, right? So again, this is a very almost ham-fisted critique of Stalin and Stalinism. And again, I want to go back to the killing of Snowball because that is considered to be, in the story and even more broadly, very pivotal how Trotsky lost out to Stalin and ultimately Stalin had Trotsky killed, right? That's a very big moment in the novella, as well as viewed as a very, big moment in terms of, 20th century history.
It is an allegory of.
I just wanted to point out.
Go ahead.
I think a lot of what you describe, I would agree with, but reading George Orwell and knowing history, he was more of an anarchist, but he was very critical of Western power as well. That's why I mentioned that the actual introduction of the book was actually censored. It is available actually online now. And basically the title reads The Freedom of the Press, actually critique of what was going on in the UK at that time. But yeah, absolutely. I think that he definitely exposes the corruption of Stalinism.
The book was censored, Joseph. Could you elaborate?
So George, obviously it was a fictional book, and as George rightfully describes, goes through the historical events of how things happened in Russia, how the revolution came about, and what it turned into, right? Like what the pigs ended up doing at the end. So it basically depicts that. There was an introduction, I can post the link, that basically talks about how George Orwell actually see this in the context of the UK. And that has to do with the freedom of the press and talks about how he saw the society that he lived in as well. But then obviously he wrote Homage to Catalonia. So that's why I said, I mean, he definitely had sympathies with Marxist ideas, did not agree with Stalin. I would not call him a Marxist or a socialist. I think he was more of an anarchist. But yeah, he has quite a bit of critique on both sides. That's what I would say.
You know, I found it interesting that in the graphic novel that, you know, it has like the famous subtitle of like a fairy story that doesn't get usually applied, but I found it interesting that the graphic novel like chose to keep it very realistic looking, right?
Well, you know what I want to comment on that's very important in the context of the novel, the novella, and just to comment someone on what Joseph said, which was that, you know, one of the pivotal moments in the novella is when they start to rewrite the rules, right? And so pigs become privileged, right? So what Orwell is critiquing is what happens in the Soviet Union, a society based on egalitarianism, right? The Russian Revolution is based on egalitarianism. What you start to get is a privileged caste system. And so, you know, they start to become, relatively speaking, wealthy within the context of the Soviet Union. And so again, this is the critique, you know, the kind of language and the kind of tortured reasoning that dominated Soviet politics, you know, with Stalin. And so, you know, we see this in novella as they start, you know, torturing language. Pigs can sleep on beds as long as they don't have blankets, right? So it's just trying to, you know, keep some of that egalitarianism there. But again, it's just really tortured, self-serving logic. So, you know, that's part of 1984 as well, whereby, right, what the Soviet Union justifying Stalinism, justifying the entrenchment of the bureaucracy, really rejecting the October Revolution, right? The Soviet leadership basically ties itself in knots trying to justify this. And in many instances, just putting out gibberish to justify its policy and politics. So this is, again, you know, what Orwell is observing as well as many other critics, and is, again, conveyed and portrayed in the novella.
But in a broader sense, like whatever the idea that has been presented in that book, I don't know the background why George Orwell wrote that book, and I guess you have explained it, George, and so do you, Yusuf. But I guess in a broader context, the idea that he has presented in the book is applicable even today as well. Like the people who feels initially like they kind of make a union against any autocratic leader, and once they get the power and once they have to rule it, and when they have to define the rules, they somehow becomes the autocratic at will in their own way. And that is the phenomena that is happening not only probably in the Russia at that point of time, but even in today's politics as well. And I guess that's why I love this book. I didn't know the background of that Russia and the Stalin part, but if I look the politics of my country, of India, or of any other country, I guess this book still is pretty much relevant.
No, I would agree, Mukesh. I think that it essentially outlines the power politics that goes on and how different groups behave, and our social behavior, you know, kind of repeats itself. So I definitely agree with you.
Well, I mean, you know,
part of the message that I get as well is that what happens in the world where like religion isn't as like central a figure, right? And then having this gap, you do kind of have an opportunity for a totalitarian state to take over, because people want to like put a whole lot of faith into any one thing, right? And that's actually, it feels like kind of currently like a lot of like our current moment, and a lot of what you see obviously with like Trump, that if you lack that central authority, wanting to shift that central authority to a political power.
Well, I mean, I think that's why I emphasize the killing of Snowball. And again, I want to stress to you in the novella, and in George Orwell's thinking, I mean, that's pivotal. So in other words, it didn't have to be this way, right? I mean, Orwell, again, I think is misunderstood in that he's not saying that this was the foregone conclusion of the Soviet Union. He's saying that indeed Stalin's rise and his installation to power was the corruption of the Soviet Union, and yes, the political deposing of Trotsky. So, you know, again, Orwell is not saying that this is the natural, logical outcome of socialist revolution. He's simply saying this is what happened in the case of Stalin, that the Soviet Union was corrupted, and indeed, in many ways, the Soviet Union was destroyed. And indeed, as later, it was literally destroyed. It was destroyed by Stalin. Again, I submit to you that this is not an argument that this is the foregone conclusion of leftist revolutionary politics. I do not believe that that's what Orwell's intent is, nor do I think that it has to be read into the novel.
A point with Orwell is he believed very strongly in the socialist ideal, intensely. And of course, as he saw the Soviet Union unfold, he realized it's not that easy. I mean, they say he remained a socialist all his life, but this is a story about where things go wrong. It's like a lot of people, you know, they're very critical of the Old and New Testament. And they say, well, that's not presenting a perfect picture of the universe. And I say, no, the Old Testament, the New Testament, well, the Old Testament in particular, is a story about good and evil, and most of the time how people go wrong. So here you are, here you have, you might say, a beginning of a Bible of socialism, a new book, which starts to teach, rather than just a perfect image that, say, Marx might have presented, this is the story of how things go wrong.
I always wonder too, and I know this isn't documented in the literature. Oh, hey, James, everyone, I came late. But I mean, it almost seems that there's not a bitterness against sort of communism or socialism, but there's almost this undertone of dire consequences or warning. Like every time I read Animal Farm, I'm always left at the impression of a warning. He's warning of something, you know, it's almost like a profound statement on not the hopelessness of a collective, but almost the impossibility. I don't know what you guys think about that.
Wasn't it like the critique against kind of like your common man? Like Joseph pointed out, like in that introduction, he's not so much concerned about the state censorship, he's concerned about self-censorship. And similarly here, like we get like over and over again where, you know, all the animals are like willing to believe whatever lies they're being told, even though they're like, they convince themselves like, oh, I must have like remembered it incorrectly. So I don't know. I do think that there's kind of a little bit of a inevitability of like the doom of man in general.
It certainly is a statement on the human existence as well. I mean, there's a huge part of, you know, greed versus honesty, altruism versus, you know, capitalism, and all sorts of themes running through about humanity as well. It's a good point.
But I think, you know, we have existed in very different ways, right? I mean, the lifestyle that we're actually living is actually quite recent. I mean, I basically come from South Asia. I come from Pakistan. And, you know, until my grandfather, not so long ago, I mean, you know, a major part, I wouldn't say a major part, but, you know, life was very different. You really didn't have to work in order to, let's say, you know, how you define work ethic was not exactly defined that way. You know, what people actually valued was leisure. The idea of hard work, I think, is a fairly recent concept that, you know, it's a virtue and it's a good thing. So I think these things change, but I think the power structure, the power structure in terms of how society runs itself, right? So we have a bunch of people who are in a group, and some people work less than others. So, you know, what kind of a society do you live in? Do you live in a society that basically benefits some people over others? Or is it an equitable society? So I think his novel is just describing, you know, when human beings actually come together, they basically behave in different ways. But I think over history, we have behaved very, very differently. I think in general, I feel that, we have become more civilized than the way we used to be. I'm not sure if the rate of change is fast enough, but I think I think what Orwell is describing in terms of the animal farm is just the human condition and different way how we struggle for authority and privilege.
So let me make a comment.
I just want to point out that Steve and Pinker belief there that we are getting better. This is, broad-based belief, which goes against my grain as a pessimist, but I just want to put that out there. We have this not axiom, this maxim here that the world, humanity is getting better. Yeah, just noting that.
Okay, Robert, go ahead.
No, I was only going to say that I've come at this from a completely different perspective. Some months ago, I started studying prehistory. I did that because I was interested in understanding what the evolutionary pressures were that resulted in our brain types and our biology, in the hopes that that would help me understand what we were predisposed to, what we were predisposed to believe would make us happy. And I have to say that so far I have learned a lot, and I now have far more questions than I ever had when I started. But one of the things I have come to appreciate is that human beings, for the vast, vast majority of our time as a species, and for all periods before that, for at least 1 to 2 million years prior to that, we lived in groups that were largely egalitarian, and we had an enormous sort of layers of structure that helped limit the accumulation of power amongst any individuals. So when I look at things like George Orwell's story, I think it's an allegory about the corruption of power and how power will corrupt even the most ideal kinds of approaches to the way we manage our relationships.
I agree. And
yeah, sorry, go ahead. I just wanted to say I agree. That was a stroke of genius right there.
But I just wanted to say, desire for power is a human thing.
It's a human thing. The question is, how do we as a group manage it? And for 99.999% of our time on this planet, and the time before we were in fact us, Homo habilis, Australopithecus, we lived in groups which were largely egalitarian, and those were the pressures that formed our biology. So while it is true, now here's the distinction I would make, and I think it's an interesting one. Consider groups where intimacy is common versus groups so big where anonymity comes into play. For instance, when we begin to think of the free rider problem, I would suggest to you that every time you hear the free rider problem, that term is being applied to an out group. And I think this is very telling.
I think as well. And you're right about the in-group, out-group, societal structure, status, everything in sociology is kind of verified and pointed to that. Then I wonder too, like, you get the outliers like Gandhi, who somehow had an immense amount of power, didn't, as far as I know, didn't let him corrupt him. I'm pretty sure he stuck to his ideals to the end. I've never caught wind of anything outlandish. And yet he took a group that weren't outliers and they just weren't active, and he activated them. So, I mean, there has to be these amazing exceptions to this rule of power corrupting. And maybe this is a broader question from Animal Farm, is how does that happen? Can you do it again? Is it something that can be controlled? Are we kind of doomed by our own nature, and these great outliers that rise like Gandhi are few and far between? Or maybe is that an evolution of something? So there's a bit of a question there, because you're right, power corrupts. You see it all over, but at the same time, sometimes you get powerful people where the power doesn't corrupt. Or maybe
the best answer I have to that, the best, and then I'll stop, and I apologize for occupying too much time.
I'm just going to ask a question here. Is utopianism real?
Get to that. I'll get that in just a second. I think that when power is pursued for its own sake, it results in the corruption we think of it historically. And when power is not pursued for its own sake, in the case of Gandhi, for example, that has a potentially different outcome, not necessarily a different outcome, but potentially a different outcome. That's the best explanation I've come up with to explain those outliers that do exactly as you describe, capture power and yet somehow deal with it in a way that is not corrosive.
Okay, but I guess what Bob was mentioning and what James were mentioning is right to an extent. Like if we see our history in the last 100 and 200 years, like most of the country who fight for their freedom, whether it's US, India, Pakistan, or a lot of other countries like who are under the colonialist rule, they became a group. They want to have their own freedom. They struggle together, and once they get their own freedom, they get the power, and that's the intent, or that's the message was there in the book, that when the power comes to you, it corrupts you. And the lesson we have learned, like in 100 years or so, that in any democratic society or in a country, you have to have some independent institution that put the check and balance on the power that has been given to certain individuals, like whether it's within the society or within the country. And I guess that's the broader message that we can draw from the animal farm. Yeah. That it's a very human nature that when the power comes to you, it has it can corrupt you, and to avoid that situation, the society in general or the country in general have to have some independent institution that has a check and balances on the individual powers in a way so that they don't go beyond a certain point.
Brilliant. I like that. And just to the question of, is utopia possible? I'm a firm believer that we create utopia within ourselves and within our collective, and we hold on to it. So it's almost transcendental, and I hate to use this term, but the feeling of love has to be generated. Utopia has to be generated. If we want a reality, we need to generate the reality from our intentions. Not to be metaphysical or quasi, the universe gives you what you desire. Not there's anything wrong with that. But our intentions ultimately drive our reality. Even to the point where, and I can't remember who said it, but it's that the mind is a place of its own. It can make a hell of heaven or a heaven of hell. So perception drives our mental cognition, which drives our motivation, which in turn creates our reality. So in a bit of a mind-bending extent, I don't know if it ties in with Animal Farm. It might actually, but that's kind of my thought on a utopia. It doesn't exist outside ourselves. We create it through our intention.
I just wanted to basically touch back on what Bob was saying and a little bit on what James was saying. Actually, depending on what perspective you have of history. So if you look at as a specific species, right? So the Homo species, obviously has been around for a long time, but Homo sapiens specifically not for more than 300 years. Our behavior has been quite different in terms of we actually start to look at art, paintings, and things of that nature in caves, like around 80,000 years ago, let's say around 100,000 years ago. And you can basically say maybe that was, you can call that, like, for instance, Yuval Noah Harari calls it like the cognitive revolution, where you actually become self-aware. But our behavior has been very different from our other cousins. We have basically, lived beyond our means. We have always grown. We obviously have a knack for understanding our environment and making very innovative tools. We sometimes, or like most of the times, don't know what to do with them, and we end up harming ourselves more than we actually, kind of benefit. But our specific history as a species has actually not been very encouraging. And I just wanted to say this because about Gandhi, that if you look at the untouchable, the lower caste in India, which was essentially represented by Ambedkar, they would give you a very different perspective of Gandhi. If you talk to basically South Africans, they will give you a very different perspective of Gandhi. I don't know if you heard, there was a controversy about people trying to tear down Gandhi's statue at one of the universities. I believe it was, I forget the name, it was an African country. But so everybody has a different experience. I think Gandhi was a very able and very shrewd politician. I think, so I don't know. I think it depends on who you listen to, will tell you different things about what he thinks about people, right? So it really depends on who you're listening to.
Well, thank you for that. I've never kind of come across that side of the history, but no, I always want to have an unbiased opinion, so that it definitely gives me a new vein of understanding about a great leader. So thank you for the information. I'll definitely take some time and read up on that.
Yeah,
is that one of the?
It is definitely true. If you were to look at, for instance, what they call that, the Salt March, and the number of people, what they was it the Salt March? Is that the number?
Yeah,
of
it was a
people
Salt March. Yes.
Yeah, it's an astonishing number of people ended up jailed, beaten. To think that that was a non-violent activity is not an accurate piece. Now, Gandhi's involvement in the violence is, people are debating that as far as I know, but for certain. Now, the question is Gandhi in the same boat as a person who seeks to continuously aggregate more and more power? Did he live his entire life in the pursuit of the accumulation of power? Did he leverage his political capital to build an economic empire? I mean, there are fundamental differences between people that accumulate power for power's sake, like a Bezos, for example, and a person that ends up with power by virtue of some position they've taken. Even though, in fact, quite a number of, I'm certainly not suggesting that Gandhi and things like the Salt March were circumstances that were all angelic. I agree with you in that regard, for sure.
I mean, I'm no expert on Gandhi, but I have read a little bit about Gandhi, and I think he's a very interesting character. I would say that Gandhi actually adopted nonviolence as a principle. He did seem like a principled person. He was very educated and had an ideology. I mean, I was just trying to say he was no saint, and he basically did his stuff. But I think he was a very, he was a very enigmatic personality, because he definitely did not live a very lavish lifestyle. I mean, he lived a very meager lifestyle. So, what tickles somebody's fancy is like very difficult to say.
I did hear a criticism years ago that when India received its independence, the only result was a lot of Indians moved into the private clubs, which had been the abode of the British. And that was all it added up to.
No, they were.
Sanjay, did you have something? You had your hand up for a little while. Did you have?
Yeah, there's a number of people have their hand up. Does anybody have something they want to interject? Sanjay, do you want to say something?
Yes, definitely. So, I mean, the discussion, we're kind of going off on a little bit of a tangent, but I think it was Bob from Seattle who brought up neurobiology. I've also studied a lot of neurobiology, and one of the aspects we're talking about is really this discussion around power struggle and what makes people behave in certain ways. And I guess we went into the focusing on Gandhi. I've read Gandhi's autobiography. I know a lot about him, but in general, in the context of Animal Farm, we were talking about these power struggles and does power corrupt? There are really two constructs in terms of the biology of our brain, of our neurobiology, that affect this. One is this thing that we call social hierarchy. Our brain is very much geared around existing in a hierarchy amongst other animals, primarily amongst other people. And then we also have this concept of what's in group and what's out group, which is again a part of the social hierarchy. And these two dynamics together cause us to either act in positive ways or negative ways. Typically, people are stuck. Most people get stuck within the social hierarchy. They're in competition. They have people attacking them, their position. I mean, they have to defend their position. That's what causes, when we say that people power corrupts, that's in fact what it is. It's not necessarily that power corrupts. That's a misnomer. It's actually that the competition to keep your position or to rise your position in the hierarchy is what causes corruption, emotional and psychological corruption. With Gandhi, I mean, he was obviously also challenged, but I think from my understanding of his behavior, and also my grandfather, he actually had worked with and lived with Gandhi. Gandhi used to have a few ashrams around India where he would set up, and my grandfather was at one of those. He lived with him for a few years. So with Gandhi, the more important element to understand is that this concept of in-group and out-group was very, very important for him. And he made that a central point of his behavior. That actually motivated him to immense levels, to the point that he was able to not get caught up in this social hierarchy in competition against other people, even though that did happen. For every politician, that happens. So he basically saw the British as an out-group who were against Indian in India. And he was very much motivated to act on that behalf. So I'll stop there. But it's very complicated what drove his behavior, but it's not what normally drives behavior among groups, within groups.
Natalia, do you have something you'd like to say?
Yeah, so that actually, after all that really elaborate discussion, it's back to the question whether the human being is it essentially good or is it essentially evil? And like taken from the things like from what Christianity taught us, it's said that humans are by nature evil and we're all sinners. So that was why we have to be able to embrace like the Holy Spirit in order to be saved. And so how does that apply to politics and like what do you guys think?
I mean, like in my opinion, people in general are not evil. It's the circumstances around the people, who kind of force them to behave in a certain way. So I'm pretty sure like all the people who, like the example of Gandhi or maybe the Sir Martin Luther King in the US, whenever there is a group of people who says like, okay, they don't get what they want in comparison to the other people in the society, obviously they form a group and then they go and they have a motive and they're going to go and fight for it. Once you get that, how you act and react is also depend upon the people or the situation around you. So I guess at the end of the day, it depends a lot on the society and the circumstantial way that a human being behaves. That's my opinion on that.
Yeah, I can add to this also.
Sorry, continue.
Sorry, I can add to this also. So the simplest way to look at this is look at infants, right? So the question is, are infants born evil or good? And the answer is neither.
Yeah.
Socialization is what drives what we would call evilness or goodness.
Agreed.
So Ajay, I think you'll find this interesting, and I don't know if you were here or not, maybe you were. I do think it's worthwhile to reflect upon what happens in social circumstances when the groups in question, when norms are formed in the presence of intimacy versus when norms are formed in the presence of anonymity. And I believe that makes a massive difference in the way we view things like the acquisition and management, the acquisition and use of power. So in intimate groups, I'll leave it at that. I just think it's worth reflecting upon.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Sanjay a question. But you don't think that some individuals, I mean, we are on a spectrum, some people have a higher propensity for violence? You don't think that? Yeah.
So the answer I gave, I guess, well, my answer was based on a normal mind, physiologically a normal mind without any physiological mental illness. There are actually two types of mental illnesses. Most people don't understand this. One is biological, and the other is learned.
Yeah.
So assuming that a child does not have a biological mental illness, they will not have a propensity toward evilness or goodness. They will derive that based on the group that they are raised within.
Right.
If somebody has a biological mental illness, that gets much more complicated, and it probably will. I wouldn't use the term evil in that case, but their behavior would be disruptive to themselves and or others. If someone learns a mental illness, that's a very different case, and that's actually, for example, when we're talking about dictators and autocratic people, those are the types of personalities we're talking about. Then it gets much more complicated.
Well, Aristotle actually made a mention. He said the freer people become, more arrogant they will turn out to be. So, what is your say on that? Do you think that's actually going to be like that in the long run, or is it possible to actually keep society in that manner, in a democratic manner?
I have an idea, and I've had my hand up for a while, so I apologize if I'm going in line. I'm on my phone, so I can't see who has their hands up. I don't know if there's a way to do that, if anyone has any suggestions.
Well, you have to go to the participants and you can view the list of people who have their hands up.
Yeah, I only see Stephen H. has his hand up.
Okay, and I think maybe Steve, you might have been ahead of me, so my apologies, but I'll make this quick. I think when it comes to morality, and this is where my mind goes, because I think I've spent a lot of time trying to understand the world outside myself, and I've come to the conclusion that when it comes to human motivation, there's very little. You can quantify it with psychology to a certain extent. You can quantify it by psychological testing. You can understand groups by sociology. But then when you start to get into the deeper questions of good, evil, is someone born evil? Is someone born good? What motivates a good person? What motivates an evil person? We can't see inside those pieces of people, the deeper parts of them. So my thought always goes back to, I can question the good and evil in others, or I can just generate my intention. And I find, actually I was talking to a Hindu priest at one of the Hindu temples, a Sai Baba temple. I ended up going there one day and I really liked it. And what he said is, he said, if we focus our attention on the external to us, we lose ourselves, including our morality and our ability to regulate our emotions. If we focus our intentions on ourselves, then we start to direct our life. If we focus our intentions on developing our internal awareness, then we become our own sense of self, and we can see what works for us and what we don't. And then essentially, we don't become our own universe because we live in a collective, but we become a self-directed entity. And then I think maybe the external question of right or wrong or morality versus immorality ceases to exist because we're essentially our own entity in a collective, living the way, barring, unfortunate circumstances, mental health and situations, etc. Even through the hardships of finance or whatever, we still control our own destinies and live our self-determined lives. And I think self-determination negates the need to understand the bigger questions.
I just wanted to basically just say two things. I think somebody asked the question if we're living in a utopia. I think that was the question. Yeah, so I think that, what James was saying, I mean, that would be one of the characteristics if you were living in one, to actually have that belief. So that would be a test to see if you are living in a utopia or not. So I just thought it was funny.
Oh, very interesting.
How would you know if you're living in a utopia? How would you be certain of it?
I'll let Stephen go, and then I'll tell you what I was thinking.
I mean, that was general for everyone. I was asking.
I think what would be really handy if we could would be to go through part 1 of the comic. And that's where the old major sells the grand vision, the grand dream to the farmyard animals. Would people be okay with that?
I'd be up for it. What does everybody else think? Just do a step-by-step through the story.
It's not actually all that long.
Right. Yeah, let's just do part 1 and see how that goes. Is everybody okay with that?
Who wants to read?
No, I'll we've done this before, Stu. Well, I have to go back to the sharing here. Okay. So if some of us are going to be more familiar with the story than others of us.
Here we are at the idyllic farmhouse.
Yeah, we
I've always
start
wanted
off
one
with
there.
this the farm itself, and there's nothing particularly unusual about the farm. It has all of our animals, our sheep and the ducks and wool, no dogs, and chickens, roosters, and of course pigs. Now here, I believe the old major, right, is the first pig we see here. He says, "Comrades," and he tells them about the dream, and all the animals have gathered around. And yeah, the major is, of course, on his deathbed here. He's just about to die, and he's telling them all that, okay, I may understand the nature of life on Earth as well as any animal. What is the nature of this life of ours? Miserable, laborious, and short. Laborious and short. We are born, we are given so much food as will keep the breath in our bodies. And those of us who are capable of it are forced to work to the last atom of our strength. And the very instant that our usefulness has come to an end, we are slaughtered with hideous cruelty. Right away, you can see, yeah, Orwell is putting a little bit of passion in here, like right at the beginning. You know you're in for it. He's just going deep into it. No animal in England is free. The life of an animal is misery and slavery. But is this the order of nature? Is it because this land of ours is so poor, it cannot afford a decent life to those who dwell upon it? And just the rhetoric and the ideology, and you see this, you can feel it stirring in you. If you really take this seriously, you feel, oh, well, yeah, well, I mean, this makes sense. No, 1,000 times no. The soil is fertile, the climate is good, capable of affording food in abundance. The answer to our problems is summed up in a single word: man. So there you go. Now we have an enemy. We have someone, something to fight against. Our oppressor, who is doing this to us, who is oppressing us. We have something to fight against, something to push against. That really stirs up the crowd. He does not produce. He does not give milk. He does not lay eggs. He is too weak to pull the plow. Yet he is the Lord of the animals. We get rid of man, and the produce of our labor would be our own. Overnight, we become rich and free. Rebellion. And so we begin. We're on this path. And he lays out a couple of rules, ground rules. Whatever is on 2 legs is an enemy. 4 legs has wings is a friend. Reasonable, assuming you're an animal, assuming you're on the animal side. We must not come to resemble man. There you go. All right. Highly idealistic rhetoric here. Yeah, I mean, sounds good on paper. No animal must ever live in a house, sleep in a bed, wear clothes, drink alcohol, smoke, trade, or kill. Yeah, we remember what we're fighting against. No animal must ever tyrannize over his own kind. We are all brothers. All animals are equal. And start them off with a good hymn and a good song that everybody can join in on, get the masses' emotions connecting, so they can bond with the comradeship. And now we have an enemy, Mr. Jones. Okay, so that's part 1. We can discuss there, part 1.
I
started our story.
I want to draw attention. Now, this is where part of the criteria that the old major lays down, and I hear this time and time again, and I doubt this this concept. Sorry, I don't have the proper word for it. But is this simply part of the order of nature? Is it because this land of ours is so poor that I cannot afford a decent life to those who dwell upon it? No, comrades, 1,000 times no. The soil of England is fertile. The climate is good. It is capable of affording food in abundance, and an enormously greater number of animals than now inhabit it. Now, this is always preached that, that the supply is infinite. The cookie jar is full of an infinite supply of cookies, and the only evil is the bad man who's stopping us from getting at the cookies. Now, this is where what I argue against. I point out that the cookies are not infinite in supply.
It's very emotional. It gives the rhetoric for the mobilizing the masses.
Sanjay, do you want to go? Because I have something to say in this regard.
Okay, go ahead.
Just a quick comment on what we just read. So there's a presumption. I mean, obviously, there are a lot of fallacies that the animals are making, but one of the most significant that I picked up on was that, this notion of 4 feet good, 2 feet bad. Well, every human begins as a 4-footed animal. So humans are actually 4-footed and 2-footed. So they began with a fairly simplistic view of the world, and that I think is going to lead to a lot of problems for them.
I wonder if that was intentional. That's very interesting.
Well, that's where I was getting, because I think Orwell, he was a very complex thinker and writer, so he may have put a lot of more subtle interpretations within the story. I haven't read this in years, so but just going back to it now, I'm picking up from additional information.
I think that, by the way, is characteristic of modernist thinking generally, that it takes a simplistic view of the world, creates a map of the world, and then applies that simplistic map to the territory. The territory is always far more complex than the map allows. And yet, the modernist thinker, Marx being an example of a modernist thinker, imposes this very generalized, very manageable, very simplistic version of that map onto the actual world, and then attempts to impose thinking, attempts to impose process upon it based upon the map, which when it hits the territory, fails. I think that's a theme that goes throughout all modernist thinking, which is characterized by these grand models of the world, which impose upon the world a simplistic structure, which in detail sort of never works out.
Well, anybody heard of Gilbert Ryle's philosophy as cartography?
I have not. Although my idea, by the way, is not unique to me. Nothing I say is actually unique to me. I wish I could take credit for it. It was actually
it makes a similar point that you have like the villager or the old person, society of all your people had a very good idea of their immediate village, landscape, whatever the features of that were, and they didn't need to know it on a map. But then philosophers, scientists, natural philosophers, call them what you will, they want to abstract from that, and they want to build a higher level of basically cartography, and that type of map maybe not even be intelligible to somebody who's used to how things were in their village. And sometimes it works in the sciences. We can arrive at very good abstraction, but in many areas of human endeavor, the maps, even if they seem promising at first, they don't oftentimes pan out, like you said. And Freud's, abstractions, those are not taken seriously anymore. Marx's ideas, or those of many other, classical economists. These things, basically, they try to do what they try to have the people who come up with these things, they have kind of has been called physics envy. But you can not even come within several orders of magnitude of the precision that people can arrive at in the hard sciences. So we are kind of condemned to be villagers, I guess.
Even think about the division of nations after World War II, or frankly, after World War I, doesn't matter. Those divisions were made thinking about the world in terms of very simplistic views. They didn't consider local realities, like, for instance, tribal boundaries, or even physical or geographic boundaries. And so boundaries were drawn defining nations, boundaries were drawn defining things which had no relationship whatsoever to the people that actually lived there.
I just want to basically go back to Stephen's interpretation of the first part. I did not see, like, I saw basically the pig talking about, they doing all the hard work and the farmer taking all the spoils. I didn't hear about infinite jar of cookie. I heard that, they basically work for some stuff and somebody basically, they think in their opinion, is not getting a fair share. So I don't understand why you get the impression that they're talking about an infinite jar of cookies.
Well, not infinite, but there he goes. The soil of England is fertile, its climate is good, it is capable of affording food in abundance to an enormously greater number of animals than now inhabit it. And this is always projected in the revolution that, our lives have been stolen, what the world that belongs to us has been stolen from us, and give us the reins of power, and that the good that will come from the world will be practically infinite. This is what I'm picking up constantly.
I would like to comment just really quickly. I'm sorry. Do we want to stick with the hands up? Because I'm good with that, and I'll stop talking. I'm perfectly happy with it.
I'm having a little bit of a trouble finding how you pick up your hand.
Go look at reactions on the bottom of your screen if you have the same kind of UI I have, and one of the reactions is raise hand.
Yeah. Well, let's.
There are two people.
On the version of Zoom you have, it might be under participants.
There are two people who have their hands up,
Yeah,
and one has never spoken before.
Good,
I think
go
it would
for
be
it.
fair to let
Fernando
people
should
have a
go
chance
next, I
to
believe.
speak.
Okay, go
I
ahead,
guess-
Fernando.
I guess just like on the infinite cookies, the message that I see is not so much that whether or not there's an infinite amount, but they're angered that someone is hoarding the majority of the resources, right? Not whether or not like there's enough to like support everyone. And then the other point that we were like touching on that Sanjay had pointed out, it really strikes me on the first part how much of the tribalism message just gets out there, right? It's always us versus them, like humans versus animals. And that's also kind of what drives on like the story later on with like pigs versus everyone else. And then even when there's a chance when they see inequality start to crop up, it's still like animals versus humans. So there is just like that tribalism element like throughout the whole story.
Well, that is what's going to get the masses mobilized if they are up against a villain, an enemy that they can all emotionally connect with.
Well, and I think this really nicely ties to what I think Sanjay said. Sorry if I jumped in across anyone. About people mobilized into action, and just this is a paraphrase, unified under one banner, under a positive purpose, generates whatever intention and energy, whether it was the Nazis under Hitler or the people under Gandhi, let's just say as a reference. But I guess what happens, and someone else alluded to this, is once the struggle is gone and the new normal sets in, maybe that's, and I think this is highlighted in the book and the comic, maybe that's where the erosion starts, is when our passions are not risen, do we return to a basic nature of collectivism, which is one in their tribe over another tribe.
Okay,
But I guess that is what has been happening over the years, like in the past century or 200 years or so. Either the leaders, they kind of create an idea so that the people can mobilize or they can go after them, either for the good in the society or for their own benefit. In the past year or so, that idea was like, every country should have their own freedom. So they go behind a certain leader and they get their freedom. And once they get the power, then where the corruption starts. Even in the today's politics, every country or some leader in some countries, they come up with a message or they come up with an idea which might not be the real one, but then they create this idea so that they can hit the people's mind and they can mobilize them and get the power and get their economic benefits if they want to. So I guess that's another point we can draw from this book.
Okay, Sanjay, I believe you're next. Sanjay.
Okay, thank you. I think there are many interpretations we can make from the section we just read. I mean, the simplest is that each animal represents a person within society. Another is that each animal represents a country within a collective of nations or continents, right? So Old Major may have been, in Orwell's view, the old guard, or let's say the British Empire in its waning days as it's dying. And then there's a new hierarchy developing in its wake. And so is it the US or Russia that'll come to power, right? In the sense of Napoleon, we didn't get to this, but Napoleon or Snowball who will rise into power, the position of power. So there are many levels we can look at from that standpoint of what does each character represent. Another element is, we mentioned, a few people mentioned this, is that of resources. And in my view, resources are not simply physical resources, but also intellectual or power-based resources. So a person, the farm needs to have resources to survive, for example, food, but the farm also needs to have knowledge to survive. And all of these animals are kind of assuming that they have one or both. They're making this assumption since the beginning that they will be able to keep themselves sustained, they're self-sustaining. And that's often what happens in many societies. And these dynamics actually are what cause the power imbalances and the internal pressures for strife and competition. And that ultimately leads to power struggles and the old power corrupts dictum.
There's a lot of people with their hands up. Let's go with Robert in Seattle first, and then Bob D. Go ahead.
My only observation was going to be that this is, again, referring to Stephen's comment, is that we've gotten much better in recent decades at understanding from the fossil record what for example, food resources were for various populations. And one of the things that is very clear is that long-term food deprivation was very rare among hunter-gatherer societies, but became extremely common in agricultural-based societies. Not because they were producing less food, they were in fact producing more food. But to the point that I think part of the Animal Farm piece is making, is that the distribution of those resources in the agricultural context came to be based on power relationships that are markedly different in the earlier egalitarian periods that marked much of our world versus the later non-egalitarian versus, or I would say anonymous cultures that came to characterize the world from agriculture forward. I just thought you might find that interesting.
Reminds me of a story of B, Ishmael. Remember those books? Bob D.
Yes, yeah, it's fascinating how many interesting ideas have come out of this book that I would have never thought of. But I would like to go back to one of our first speakers, who I don't think is here anymore. I think his name was George. And he pointed out that this is a political story. And it was, I think. And maybe you can elaborate and go on, onto other topics like evolutionary biology and things like that. But if you analyze this story, this book is about Stalinism. And you can see the figures in Russian history in this fable. Major is Lenin. And I think George was correct in identifying Snowball as Trotsky and Napoleon as Stalin. And if you pursue this line, you can see a lot of parallels. Like Frederick represents Germany, and when he makes a pact with Germany, and I think Foxtrot or whatever the other form was is Britain. So I believe whatever else Orwell was trying to do, He was a very political writer, and I think you can see that in 1984 about the power of politics to manipulate and manipulate people through language. And also another thing that's very unique about Stalinism, maybe not quite unique though, is how he treats his own followers. Later on in the novel, might remember how he turns against all his former supporters, and he just brutally murders everyone who said anything bad against him. Napoleon in the novel, he just turns against anyone. He uses his dogs to essentially eliminate people who's offended him. And that has, again, a direct parallel in Stalinism. Stalin was a monster. He killed millions of his own people, including his own friends, including people who were with him in the beginning of the revolution. He killed a lot of people. And so I think whatever else you can make out of this novel, and you guys are, very creative, and I think all the comments are very thoughtful. I guess I'm kind of like an originalist. I like to think first that this is a political novel, and it has a lot of power because of how it reveals. In those days, a lot of people supported Stalin. In America too, a lot of people thought he was great, and I think Orwell is trying to let people, take the scales off people's eyes and make them realize what a monster he was. I just wanted to go back to this concept. Thanks.
Okay, Sam, you have something to say next?
Sorry, unmuting. Yeah, I did a link to a preface to Animal Farm that appeared, guess what, more than 20 years after Orwell's death. So, in a book, well, I mean, he was a opponent of censorship, but yeah, he himself, I guess, suffered from it. And I agree. Yeah, I mean, sure, you can basically interpret, literary works in many ways, but this is almost certainly related to what happened in Russia, and the characters map very cleanly, as was just pointed out. And he says in that preface that he had planned on writing this since 1937, which is when he was returning from Spain, having been shot and having seen what he had seen, that the party supported by the Russians, they were stabbing everybody else in the back, and in the name of socialism, they basically brought about the ruin of the alliance that had formed, the Popular Front, so-called, or I don't know if it was necessarily called Popular Front, but anyways, just to say that, yeah, he despised them. And there is speculation that, yeah, had he lived, he might even have become a kind of a, as happened with many others, a sort of a anti-Moscow ideologue. A lot of the Trotskyites, they went that path. So it's kind of an open question whether he himself would have gone down that path. But yeah, I mean, this is very much related to the Russian, whatever happened there. And in fact, that was one of the reasons why it was basically promoted so heavily by, guess what, the three-letter agencies and the movie studios that were told to create it. The history of how the movie was made in the 50s and things like that. Yeah, that's also quite interesting.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that Orwell was definitely writing an allegory for the historical events. I mean, it's hard to make any mistake on that.
It's been long taught in schools all over the world as being exactly that. And socialism as a way of importing industrialization and then nationalizing companies is something that continues on today in communist Russia. And so how do we apply Animal Farm to our current political structures in the world and the changing economy, the world economy? So it's always been really the Americans were defining the world economics. We went through in the 80s where we were ignoring the cost of transporting materials. Now we're back paying attention to that. But, it used to be in North America, corporations would spend a third on their employees, a third on training, and a third goes back to the shareholders. Economists changed that to 70, 20, 10. Where most of it goes to the shareholders. And that was done purely as an economic policy. So now we know that our chairman of the Chinese party wants to start setting economic policy for the world. And who's to say that he shouldn't? Or that he and the other few elites in China shouldn't, since they are the people who hold more people and more wealth in their hands. And so when we look at Animal Farm and tribalism, and we look at racism, gender politics, how does any of that impact us today? Because, we are in one of the greatest revolutions worldwide in the history of the world. And there has to be lessons in George Orwell's writings, be it Animal Farm in 1984 for us now.
I think that, and that is a great question, Cindy. And I can't remember when I heard this, but essentially my understanding of capitalism is capitalism was originally designed by the founding fathers in America as a hybrid of socialism with independent autonomy, with the sole intention that if you give someone free reign over the economy or certain parts of the economy, and they could accumulate wealth, and they can then in turn use that generated wealth outside of a standardized wealth to raise other people up who could then copy the model. So my understanding is capitalism started off as a form of socialism. Mm-hmm. Yep. And then, as for the global world, we're so big and we're so uncollected, and there's so many governments and there's so many private corporations. I mean, that's a broader picture question, but it'd be nice to be able to see an answer to that one. I can't conceptualize it, but what a great question.
Stephen, do you have a comment?
Yeah. Let's. I think Metalia brought up a question here. Then why are socialists so optimistic about the endeavours of humanity? Again, it's the utopianism, and James added on the term unified under one banner. Well, of course, here we have the story of the Tower of Babel. That humanity was united; they were all under one language, one idea, one king. And they were building this structure to compete with God. And so God and his angels come down and said, enough of that. Let's put something in man that divides him, that turns them against each other. And that results in a collapse of the endeavours of the Tower of Babel. Now, I don't remember all the detail, but this is possibly summed up in the story with the windmill. The windmill starts off as a project of Snowball, which Napoleon poo-poos, and he gets rid of Trotsky and suddenly decides the windmill's a great idea, and they're always trying to build the windmill, and it first falls because it's not very sound, and then the evil humans come back to take back Animal Farm and destroy the windmill in the process. Now, I don't quite remember if they actually succeeded in building the windmill in the end. Okay, anybody have any thoughts about that?
I think at the end of the book, I think they did create the final windmill. It was reinforced, double thick walls.
Yeah, that's this story, of course, hinges on that idea of unity. If we were all unified, we would build the great pyramid of society. But it's also the story of how there are those qualities which the individualism which eventually pulls apart that unity.
I like that idea. And then I wonder too, and I've never thought about this before, or maybe I have, and I just, haven't thought about this in a while. does the windmill represent something? Like, is it representative of something? I think if Orwell would have picked a windmill, there must have been a purpose, because he could have picked a couple different things. And so in regards to your question, Stephen, which I think is really good, unity under one banner for a project, what was the windmill? And, is there a link now to our current circumstances? Something like that.
Okay, I thought Sam had his hand up. Sam, did you want to say something, or are you good?
Yeah, sorry, I just lowered it.
Oh, that's fine. No problem. Robert, go ahead.
Bob?
Which one? There's two Bobs. I think
Bob
Bob
Seattle.
Seattle was first.
I remember Robert from my other group, and I call him Robert.
Fine, no problem. I was going to make a sort of tangential comment, and take it for what it's worth. I've heard the word tribal used several times, and I don't want to pass it over because I think it's key. And this is related to something Yusuf said earlier with respect to the longevity of the human species. Because I believe that tribalism is instinctual. In other words, humans could no more not form tribes than fish could form schools, or birds would flock, or cows would herd, or whatever it is you sort of think of. We are instinctually, we are bound to tribalism. There is simply no way to avoid it. There is no such thing as an individual. It does not exist anywhere and never has. What's the worst punishment we have? Isolation. Put yourself on a desert island and you will be driven mad. There is no such, the individual simply doesn't exist outside the context of tribal relationships. And what are all these things talking about? In my view, they're all describing social relations. And you could substitute social for tribal. They're all describing tribal relations. And this is true not only of humans, but it is true of our immediate predecessors. If you look at Homo habilis, if you look at any of the homos, look at any of the Australopithecines, they are all tribal in nature. In fact, you could go back 10 million years and every known progenitor species for humans are tribal in nature. And if you look at our current simian relatives, they are all tribal in nature. Therefore, tribalism is absolutely fundamental to human relationships. And I'll stop now, but I will suggest that what I've learned is that there is something uniquely human about tribal relationships that is actually different than the tribal relationships of our predecessors and different than the tribal relationships of our simian cousins. That I know it's maybe sounds random. I just think it's relative given the nature of Animal Farm, what we're looking at, and the nature of the discussion generally.
Some more people. How about Bob D now?
Yeah, I just wanted to go to the windmill thing. And I think, I can't help but think of Don Quixote when the windmill is pointed out. And I think it's an interesting, symbol in the novel because it represents two things at the same time. It represents the practicalities of industrialism and progress, because Snowball, who again I think represents Trotsky. Trotsky was the great thinker in the revolution, and he was the most progressive of all the revolutionaries, I think. And it represents progress, but at the same time, it also is it's kind of like an ideal that may not be obtained because think of animals trying to build it, and they had a great deal of difficulty, as was described, building the windmill. So in a way, it was an unachievable ideal, as in Don Quixote trying to knock down the windmills, which was kind of a futile endeavor. So at the same time, it kind of represents a futile endeavor. And again, that was, I think, also true in Stalinism. A lot of things that Stalin was trying to accomplish couldn't be accomplished because they were just too impractical. And so I just wanted to mention that since someone brought that up.
Okay, I think Xiaolin next.
Hello, everyone. I heard a lot of interesting thoughts, and I'm really inspired by all of them. And also, I really like seeing this question, and I want to express my opinion on it. Firstly, I have to admit that my English is not that great, so maybe I might not express myself appropriately. If so, please correct me. And I read this story, Animal Farm, a long time ago, so I might not remember it clearly. I remember the first beginning, and a pig or a prophet told the other animal, man is the enemy. However, after some years, there are other pigs against the first pig's opinion. Then maybe the third pigs have another opinion against the second pig or something like that. So it promotes my opinion. I think enemy is just an illusion, because the first pig's enemy and the second and the third, they all have different enemies. And I think enemy is just an illusion from knowledgeable people's opinion at that time, or some dominant met the enemy to achieve their interests. So for us, we might not knowledgeable than the wisdom people, or we have no ability to against the dominant one. So maybe compare with some ambitious or some serious approach, I prefer to just promise me to have option to choose where to live, or how the possible to become more knowledgeable to dispel the illusion. And so I might not be confused by the animal, the notion of the animal, just become a clear one. Yeah, that's my opinion. That's all.
It's a rich work to delve into if you really want to. I mean, a lot of people have done a lot of critical analysis of George Orwell's Animal Farm, and there's a rich background of critical assessment. Maybe we'll get into it in a little bit. Stephen's already posted a link, but let's see some more comments. Sam, I think you're next. Go ahead.
Yeah, one thing which I'm not clear about, and I'm sure somebody must have looked into it and written about, is that the takeover of power doesn't seem quite congruous with what happened in Russia. And basically there was the February revolution, which is what actually deposed the king. In fact, brought his whole, the Tsar, and brought his whole, line of reign of the whatever Romanovs to an end. And the actual takeover of power by the Bolsheviks, that occurred, 8-9 months later. So that, doesn't seem to me quite as easily captured in Animal Farm. And I'm not sure how, was he using some sort of literary device, and is there can anybody tell if there's an allusion there to that, or is this more of a simplified version in which he just says that the animals took over, and without going into that particular aspect. In fact, even the role of Lenin, that is apparently fused with that of Marx. I guess you could say that, Marxism, Leninism, maybe he's alluding to that, but so I mean, I guess it's not by design. I mean, because he had total control over what characters he put in and didn't. So I don't think he's being quite so literal minded to basically write it as a work of history. It is more of a basically kind of a fable and an illusion. But nonetheless, it does have a lot of what happened in the real world as well, or maybe the element of I think verisimilitude would be the technical term, goes up after the takeover of power, when it actually starts tracking what happened in the Soviet Union. So anyways, just if anybody knows why the takeover of power is not clear, and that would be interesting to know. Thanks.
Well, could I just jump in? Because I've recently read the biographies of Stalin, and I'm very interested in Russian history. And I think to write a fable that details all the complexity of what happened during that period of time would make it no longer a fable. It would make it a historical work. And there's been many books written about the revolution and from different perspectives. So I think Sam, you can't treat it strictly as a historical work. You have to treat it as, I think the way I treat it is it's a critique, a political critique of Stalinism. That's the way I take it. And there are, I think there are enough. There's a simplified version of events. I think and you have in any literary work, ellipsis, where you take something and you just delete a lot of things in the middle in order to make your central point. So I wouldn't recommend it as an historical work. I think that would be misleading.
Sure, thanks.
Stephen, you want to go over the lessons?
I was just going to point out at this point that one of Orwell's central points, which might be getting a little bit overlooked, I'm only saying might be, was that these lead revolutionaries of the party who wanted to overthrow the evil oppressor, Orwell's point always it was, and in this case he's in particular referring particularly to his own British socialists, that they wanted to overthrow the ruling class, but their real nature was this, and this is what he claimed they were about, that really they only envied those above him. And the proles that were below them, they had nothing but contempt for. And that was Boxer. The proles below them were the great animals that were pushing society along, and really nothing but contempt for these dumb animals. They, the smart animals, were going to use the dumb animals to destroy the smart animals that were above them and take what they had. And this was Orwell's point, was essentially their motives were always selfish.
All right, James, next.
Sorry about that. I had to mute myself. I think too, when I look at Animal Farm, and I mean, Grapes of Wrath, and we can't do all of that, but The Grapes of Wrath is another fascinating novel. I always look at Animal Farm, and maybe this is just my read into it or my intuitive sense of it, is it's a warning. I always look at Animal Farm as it's part history. It's a wonderful work of fiction. It's a great, story, questions all sorts of areas of philosophy, especially ethics. But then it's also a dire warning. I always look at it as a warning. And a warning more towards, I don't know if it would be socialism or communism, excuse my microwave. But then I also look at Grapes of Wrath as a warning against capitalism. But I always look at Animal Farm specifically as a warning to people. And I don't know if Orwell meant it that way. However, he's very intelligent, did work on multi-layers. So maybe there is something in there.
Okay, Fernando next.
That both being a warning and kind of like to Stephen's point, like one of the saddest aspects I find in the story is that the pigs were like taught themselves to read, and it kind of like that they weren't able to like share that knowledge, right? And like how we value like knowledge work, and they end up like controlling everything. Versus obviously like Boxer, who's actually doing all the work, because that definitely feels like to translate into what we do with our current economy. It kind of like once you're able to like sort of like corner the market of like who gets paid what. Bob had mentioned, or Robert had mentioned this before, that throughout like I guess like human societies, that there's kind of like a natural stasis that we end up hitting, that like once someone controls too much wealth, it sort of gets like shifted back. But I guess like with the advent of like literary societies and like with banks and with like money systems, I guess the danger becomes that those natural checks and balances don't ever come back, right? Because those groups find a way to just like hold on to it forever.
Well, I checked out the link that Stephen gave us, and it does say the windmill is symbolic of industry in the Soviet Union before and during the time of the book's publication.
Yeah, there's a canal in the Soviet Union that was built in the 20s, if I remember correctly, and that was heavily publicized. But it was basically a waste of effort for whatever technical reasons. It couldn't be traversed by ships or larger ships. But yeah, it was just, I mean, there were all kinds of projects done that, yeah, didn't really make a great deal of sense. But I guess there were worthwhile projects too. I mean, they were building pretty good military equipment by the start of World War II.
Yeah, it also says the windmill serves as a symbol for the dreams of the people. While some people prefer to work hard and hoard resources to secure their future, others want to reduce their workload and have more comfortable lives. Yeah, the windmill was given as something that would reduce everybody's workload in the long run. That some people, the windmill itself was the goal, to work hard at something, perhaps. So it could serve double duty as a symbol, I suppose. It's just a symbol for different dreams that people might, the people, well, in this case, the residents of the animal farm might have. James, or did you just have your hand up?
Sorry, I forgot to take my hand down.
Okay. Yeah, and it's very explicit. Snowball represents Trotsky, who believed in promoting technology and spreading communism. Napoleon is Stalin, who believed in building a strong army.
Well, it's a key element, of course, was in the end that party did become about trying to succeed where the more westerly countries had become very strong in terms of technology. So that was the thing. They saw that they were backwards, or decided they were backwards, and they had to get out there and grab some of that technology. That was the grand symbol that they were going to catch up with and then surpass the capitalistic West in terms of technology.
Yeah, this is still going on, and that project has been going on for 300 plus years since the start time of Peter the Great. Just last week, Italy expelled 2 Russian diplomats who were buying secrets of, basically Western plans. And yeah, that game has been going on for 3 centuries or more.
Yeah, but the Italians stole spaghetti from the Chinese.
Let me ask a question. This may be a bit off topic, I'm sorry. But all this has led me to a number of things, among them postmodernism. And so I have been studying Foucault recently. And one of the stories I have read in this regard, which leads me to believe that it is extremely difficult to draw conclusions from a simplistic reading of history, is this event in 1916. Has anybody have read about Murderous Mary? Murderous Mary was an elephant. In 1916, Murderous Mary killed her handler. And so Murderous Mary was put on trial. An elephant in 1916 in the United States was put on trial and defended. And people were called back and forth, to testify on behalf or against Murderous Mary. And in the end, Murderous Mary was hung. Literally, they hung an elephant and people showed up.
Sorry, I have to interject. Are you telling me in all honesty, and I don't doubt you for a minute, that they actually hung an effing elephant? Because that's ridiculous.
Exactly what I'm fucking.
Oh man,
it's unbelievable that they did this. Now, what this leads me to believe is the Foucault's concept of an episteme, which suggests that there is a sort of he used it is a linguistic boundary, is a mindset that defines a generation. And it is extremely difficult if we just try to think about how bizarre it is that you would show up, that like you and your family would like get in the bus and hustle on down to watch the elephant being hung for killing their handler.
I just looked it up. I saw the picture of the elephant being hung.
It's like insane, right? And yet we're reading, like when Frederick Engels and Trotsky were writing, this is the world view. This is among the things that characterized their world view. This is among the things that sort of typified life in those days amongst the ordinary folks. So I'm only pointing out that it's like, oh my God, like how hard is it to be an historian? How hard is it to sit back and try to understand what they were meaning when they said A, B, and C? Did they really mean A, B, and C? Are we thinking about that correctly? I mean, how do we know, given that there are some outlying behaviors that are, they totally bizarre, that are sort of hard to understand? I know that seems out of the question, but we sit back and talk about this guy and that guy and what history tells us this and what this person wrote and what that person wrote. But when we look at the context in which those things are written are, oh my God, hard to identify with. Sorry, maybe that was random, but it like surprises me that we're so weird when we look back on humanity and how difficult it is to find common thread, to find commonality with people through different periods.
But that happens in every era. I mean, like the example that you have gave, Bob, like in 1960s. I'm gonna give you an example that happens like in my country, in India, which is again a very bizarre thing to happen, and the people get killed over the fact that they might be eating a beef, which is against our religious belief, being an Hindu. So I don't think so. If you tell this story to anyone in the US, they might be thinking like, what the hell is going on? So there is always a bizarre thing that goes in a different society, in a different country. I guess what Orwell was stating his state of mind, what he was going through at that point of time, when he was writing the Animal Farm. And I guess the best we as a society can think what we can do or what we can draw the conclusion from his experiences to put it in the context of what we are living right now to make our society in a better way. And I guess in this conversation, like the conversation we all are having right now, where we are coming from a different backgrounds, from the different countries and from the different era as well, giving our point of view and stating that, okay, some of the bizarre things happen, some of the bad things happen, but how we can make a good in a society based on our experiences, I guess that's the best we can do.
Yeah, I just added in the chat the name of a book which came out in the early 70s, the Meta History, and he goes into how it is possible to portray historic events in so many different literary forms. Emplotment, as he calls it, you can basically plot it in one way, another way, as a satire, as a tragedy, comedy, same event. And there are some canonical examples. There are events on which there still is huge differences in interpretation. But there was later some, backlash to that as well. And Foucault's, ideas also are no longer taken anywhere near as seriously as they were 25, 30 years ago. We have actually good records for certain events, the French Revolution, American Civil War. And yeah, sure, I mean, people's ways of thinking were different, but that is the job of a good historian to uncover as much as they can. And it's really kind of one aspect that one person can work on, somebody else works on something else, and the composite picture that they created, it has a real value. But based on that, we can then still draw very different value judgments, and there is no possibility of, say, arriving at a perfectly standard interpretation of the Civil War, French Revolution, or these major events. There's one historian, for example, in the last few days, his major specialty is just bread, the composition of bread, the calories needed, and he is like a total geek on the concept of bread and how bread played, or lack of bread played, into the French Revolution. So yeah, you can basically do the deep dive on aspects that are just other historians might have completely forgotten that, yeah, how important this particular event was. And that's absolutely true. Even people like 10, 15 years ago, their mindsets were different, especially with the younger generation, as anybody can attest.
I think Sam might be next. Just looking at the list here.
I think James is next.
Oh, am I? Okay, thank you. I had to share something interesting, and then there was a reference to 1984. So I live in Alberta, Canada, and we have what's called, and I don't know how familiar you guys are with opiate addiction. I know it's running rampant in a bunch of different countries, but we have something called harm reduction, which is essentially giving out free needles, giving like all safe places to use injectable drugs. Idea being, if the client overdoses or needs medical attention, they're being accessed by professional staff, dealing with medical before an emergency, which is always more cost effective, also saves lives. Now we have the government change from a fairly liberal style government that pumped a ton of funding into harm reduction, to a much, much, much more conservative style government that does not believe in harm reduction. There's a program in downtown Calgary, actually there's similar programs all over Alberta that are very successful. It's injectable opioid agonist therapy program, where hardcore fentanyl addicts can go and get hydromorphone, which is essentially heroin. So they can actually have heroin delivered to their house if they have mobility issues, or they can go in and inject themselves with heroin. The government pays for the heroin for them to inject themselves 3 times a day. The logic is it costs considerably less money to give them this pharmaceutical grade heroin in a safe place, monitor their medical situation, than it would be to have them homeless, broke, on the street using medical services. The government cut these programs. Now, the scary thing is, and this is Canada, Alberta, Canada, they have said that you cannot mention the IOT program, injectable opioid agonist therapy program, and they've erased the term harm reduction from the medical language that healthcare practitioners can use. So not only are they dismantling these programs, in my mind, they're highly successful and saving a ton of money in human lives, but they're actually banning staff from using common language that's used across the world. And that is just spooky to me. And like, they're serious about it. Like, you can't write a memo, you can't write an email, you don't mention this. I don't know what they could do if you did. I mean, they would probably do something, but it's just ridiculous. And I had to share that because it's a perfect example of things going sideways, in my opinion.
Yosef, you've had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say that, George Orwell actually wrote like a preface. So it actually describes quite nicely. I was just reading it in terms of what his intent was and who he was referring to. And I think Bob's description is quite accurate. So I don't think we have to wander off too much in terms of what his intent was. But I do think that you can interpret whatever he wrote in the current context as well. But I would say that would be a personal interpretation, because I think he very much laid out what he was thinking.
Yeah, as I said, critical assessment of Orwell's Animal Farm has been going on for decades, and it's one of the most critically analyzed works, I think, of the 20th century. I think I don't think there's a lot of controversy about what Animal Farm is intended to represent and the symbolism of it all.
I'm going to go watch the movie tonight.
Yeah.
I'm going to do it. I haven't seen it in a long time. I've read it in a long time. I think it's going to be a blast.
Yeah. Stephen, why is Animal Farm relevant today?
Oh, well, I think it's actually probably best summed up in Goldstein's his manifesto from 1984. And he says essentially the revolution is about class society and the middle class overthrowing the upper class to replace them. And this has been all throughout history. And so what today, if we're seeing a revolution today in the Western world, it's all about a middle class saying they're there to help the lower class, but essentially the middle class wishes to overthrow the upper class and replace them, and then things will be back to the normal class-based society. So we have these three broad classes: an upper class, a middle class, and a lower class. And I think the big question is how they differ.
Yeah, and the thing is, I think it's sort of an artificial construct. It doesn't have to be. We don't have to organize society in that way. But it serves certain powers that be interests to have a society structured in that way. In other words, it's very profitable to do so. Bob D, go ahead.
Yeah, you can apply the Animal Farm to Mao. I think Mao, and was even in terms of numbers of people he killed, he's probably even more of a monster than Stalin was, although they come close. And I think in Kim Jong-un is kind of a model too of how things can go awry in political systems. And I just want to mention that I found it very amusing when I was looking. I got the book. I didn't read the comic. I got the book and I read the book. And I found it in the young adults section of the library. So I thought, for a book that is so famous and so critically analyzed, it's interesting that the library puts it in the young adults section.
Yeah, well, as I said, I think a lot of high schoolers read it. I think it's taught in very many middle school and grade school and high school classes. We didn't read it. I think we went through a survey of overview of it, and we watched the movie. And as I said at the beginning, I think this graphic novel could be a very good introduction to grade schoolers and middle schoolers to this great work. All right, we're at the 2-hour mark. I think everybody got a lot to say about Animal Farm. I think this is an important book. We should probably remember it as we go through these parlous, dangerous political times that we are in right now. Does anybody have any final comments as we wrap up here?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Has anybody read one or all 3 volumes of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago?
I'm not surprised that Stephen has. I'm not surprised.
And my only question is, did you find that a valuable exercise? Because I'm really intimidated. I've started it for reasons similar, by the way, to Animal House, but I'm super intimidated because it must be like, I don't know, 10,000 pages. It's like incredible. And I've started the first one and it's not really exciting. It's not a, you're not going to be on the edge of your seat on the basis of the first, I don't know, couple hundred pages of the Gulag Archipelago. So tell me, is it worth it to go through this?
I think I only read the first volume. I was a teenager when I read it. And of course, as a teenager, you're full of tremendous mental energy. And even the Gulag Archipelago is interesting. But I would say it's a very voluminous book that does make a lot of very important points. And I guess if you want to investigate this sort of field, it's one of those required readings. So there's no way out of it. But honestly, I was entertained by what I read. At the time, I was probably, I don't know, 17, 18, how old I was. But yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think I got, it was probably only the first volume.
Kudos to you, dude. I mean, it's this freaking big. But it's supposed to be one of the most amazing nonfiction books of the 20th century. So, okay, fine. With that kind of pedigree, I feel like I'm obligated.
I think the volume I read was 600 pages long, and it was possibly the first book.
It's the first volume, right? That would be the first volume.
It's
okay, thank you. I appreciate your indulgence, David. I was just curious what I was biting off.
It's nonfiction?
It's nonfiction. Well, supposedly it's nonfiction, yes. It's his story.
Well, the interesting bit was how to pass on messages in prison. So you get out the pen and you make holes beneath certain letters in the books that were being circulated from the prison library. And that's how you got to talk to other prisoners.
It's a whole subject for a different discussion, but it doesn't matter. It's a whole different discussion. Why I would be interested in this, but
yeah,
thank you.
Animal Farm. And if you do want to, if you know any, like anybody with nieces or nephews or young cousins, want to introduce them, yeah, buy this graphic novel for them. I think this is important for anybody's political education. I think this is or if they're not going to read the original, and let's face it, a lot of kids probably just won't. But this is an important book, and we shouldn't forget it as we go into the deeps of the 21st century here.
I just wanted to say, thanks to everybody. I mean, what a fantastic discussion. It went in so many different directions, and we kept bringing it back to the book. Lots of great thinkers here I can tell, from very diverse backgrounds. So this was a truly enjoyable discussion. So thank you to y'all. Genuinely appreciate it.
It was very good. Yeah. Thanks for
everybody. Thanks, guys. Thanks.
Thank you.
Participating. Yeah, definitely. All right, everyone. I guess we'll see you in our next group, whichever one you intend to join up. We're here every Friday, but we're not always doing deeper things. Sometimes we do lighter things in our graphic novel discussion group.
What is your meetup.com what for your group?
Yeah, Barbara, I think I gave you the list for.
You gave me the West Coast, East Coast. What's the one that you have there?
No, they're all mine. They're all mine. Yeah, that one's mine. You can join that one, Barbara. That's mine.
You mean they're all different? You have a lot of them?
That's right.
Oh, okay.
That's right.
Thank you.
Okay, hope you join, and I guess I'll see you all at another group. Maybe this one, maybe not. But
I have a
I
question.
recognize most of you.
I have a question for you though, David. I was trying to get on the movie group, and the software you use, I'm not a member or something. I don't know if I'm missing something, because I'd love to watch the movie tomorrow as well. And I can't figure out the cast system. I don't think that I was accepted. I don't know if you want to talk about that now, or if I can just send you a message. I just didn't want to let you go before I checked in with you.
It seems to me that if you have applied for me to accept you, then I would have done so. In fact, while you're here, I'll check right now, and I'm looking at it, and it says everybody who has given me a request to join. I mean, there's no pending requests at the moment, so either you have done so and I have accepted, or you have not done so, in which case that is something you should do. Send me the application if you have not. If you have, then you're on.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll have to figure out how to work the software then. I thought I did, but I'll hop on and see what we can do.
How does
what
the
I can
movie?
do.
How does the movie night work? Do you just watch the film, or do you have a discussion? And
We'll watch the film, and if anybody wants to have a discussion, we'll discuss it afterwards.
oh, okay,
Anybody
sounds
wants
good.
that?